Today we're going to be in the 9th chapter of the book of First Chronicles. And we're going to see a couple of things that are interesting. One is we're going to talk about a real shift in the content. And then we're going to see a focus. What is this chapter focusing on? And it'll be interesting from our perspective as people that may not be as familiar with the details as we'd like. And we'll see that and talk about that today when we come right back. Hi, and welcome to Bible Study with Friends, where our goal is to help you get more impact from your Bible study. I'm here with my friend Kyle Grinstead, and Kyle and I are continuing our study in First Chronicles. And today we're in an interesting chapter in the genealogies. And we're just about done with the genealogies, and we're going to be moving into the story of Chronicles in the next couple chapters. But today is an interesting chapter from the aspect of it's a shift. There is a new theme and a new focus in this chapter, and I want to talk a little bit about that today. Now, we have been looking at the last 8 chapters, and one of the things we've been noticing, Kyle, is that he's talking about all these tribes coming back from the captivity. And he's mentioning tribes and cities and territories and even people groups in order to, and we've talked about this, the emphasis on that is what? Why does he emphasize cities and territories and people?
Because they're the remnant, the people coming back from the exile are trying to reestablish life in Israel. And so they need to know, hey, where did my ancestors live? So I can know where should I set up.
Okay, and we've said a number of times that these areas are telling people that are coming out that relate to the ancestry, this is where I could go, and even the kind of trades that I could get into. And we've mentioned that in the context of not everybody can live in Jerusalem.
Right.
They're being released to go back to rebuild the city of Jerusalem, rebuild the walls, rebuild the temple. But the chronicler is making the point that not everybody can live in Jerusalem. It's not big enough for the whole nation to come back. This chapter all of a sudden switches, and Jerusalem becomes the focus of now there are going to be people who should live in Jerusalem. If you want to see the bracket, read verse 3 of chapter 9.
Some of the sons of Judah, some of the sons of Benjamin, and some of the sons of Ephraim and Manasseh lived in Jerusalem.
Now read verse 34, the last verse.
Okay. These were heads of fathers' households of the Levites according to their generations, chief men who lived in Jerusalem.
All right, so the chronicler, Ezra, is trying to get people now to say, we don't want everybody to live away from Jerusalem. There are people that have genealogies connected directly with Jerusalem. So
Okay.
that's a shift in theme, that now we're not going to be talking about outside territories and people groups and tribes. We're going to be talking about people living specifically in Jerusalem for this whole 34 verses. Okay? The other thing we want to notice that's unique is it's going to be very informative for us, because we're going to see mentioned the people that live in Jerusalem in a very specific outline. Let's look at these verses. First of all, we get a very interesting verse. Verse 1 talks about why they went into captivity. Read verse 1.
While Israel was enrolled by genealogies, and behold, they are written in the book of the kings of Israel. And Judah was carried away into exile to Babylon for their unfaithfulness.
Now, 2 things here. Number 1, this is a summation of the 8 chapters we've just got done with. All Israel was enrolled by genealogies, and he's just gone through all those genealogies, right?
Yep.
And says, behold, they're written in the book of the kings of Israel. In other words, they're recorded. And Judah was carried away. He was the last group where Jerusalem was that got carried away into Babylon. But notice he mentions why they got carried away into the exile.
Yeah,
You
for
see
their
that there?
unfaithfulness.
Now, we've talked about this already. What he's doing now is when we are released to go back to Jerusalem, we want to go back correctly, and we want to go back with as much faithfulness as possible, because the reason we got sent away in the first place was because of unfaithfulness.
Okay.
Now, you notice in that verse, it's a summation because it says all of Israel. Now, then jump down to verse 3, and it says some of the tribes were living in Jerusalem. So he
Okay.
goes from a summation of all the tribes to now we're going to talk about a few tribes that are connected directly to Jerusalem.
Got it. Okay.
So now let's read verse 2, because verse 2 is going to give us the outline of the rest of this chapter. Let's look at this.
Now, the first who lived in their possessions in their cities were Israel, the priests, the Levites, and the temple servants.
All right, now what we see here is an outline of the rest of this chapter in 3 headings. Obviously, Israel, which is mentioned up in verse 1, but now we're talking about the priests, the Levites, and the temple servants. And you and I talked about before, besides the line of Messiah through King David, the other big focus from the chronicler is the temple worship, the priests, and what they're going to be doing.
Yeah.
So now this chapter is focusing back on Jerusalem and specifically on the priests, the Levites, and the servants in the temple. And we're going to see that very clearly as it starts to go through. And we'll notice that because it's going to give us a lot of information. As Gentiles, you and I might go, okay, the temple, but do we really know what goes on in the temple? Do we know what's involved with the correct functioning of the temple? And when they come out of the captivity, 70 years, this new generation may be as ignorant as you and I are about how things are supposed to work in the temple.
Yeah.
Because they've been without a temple for quite a while. A couple of generations have lived in Persia, and they may have a better understanding of how Persia works than how the temple is supposed to work. Now, but they got to be careful, because now we want to go back to the temple in Jerusalem, and we want to go back correctly. So now all of a sudden, we need to be interested in how to correctly function in the temple. Now, there's some distinctions here that are interesting too. What's the difference between a priest and a Levite? An interesting question.
Yeah.
Who are the priests?
The priests are a subset of the Levites, right?
The priests were descendants of Aaron.
Okay.
All right. Who was the first chief priest. And the priests were directly descended of Aaron. But there were a lot of other Levites from other sons and daughters that weren't directly related to Aaron. And so they weren't priests, but they were Levites.
Okay.
And they had a function other than priests. Priests had a function, the Levites had a function. And then there's another interesting subset, and it talks about the servants of the temple. Now, the servants of the temple were also Levites. To serve in the temple in any function, you had to be connected with the Levites. You may not be a direct descendant of Aaron, but you were a descendant of the Levite tribe.
Okay.
And you had the cities. Remember, we talked about the cities of refuge that were spread all through Israel. And the Levites were administrators of those cities and administrators in the temple. And we're going to see that here as we go. But it's very interesting. We're going to see those 3 things, the priests, the Levites, and the servants in the temple, as an outline of what he covers and in the order he covers it. So let's go back. Now we're picking up, if you noticed the heading here, he starts to talk about the general genealogies of the people that come back to Jerusalem. And that goes from verse 2, if you notice here, this bracket, all the way down to verse 9. And we saw in these verses the sons of Judah, the sons of Perez, the sons of Benjamin, right?
Yep.
So you see a connection back with these people from Israel, from various tribes, who are going to come back and be connected directly to Jerusalem. In fact, up here in verse 3, it says, sons of Judah, sons of Benjamin, the sons of Ephraim and Manasseh lived in Jerusalem. So people from a number of tribes lived in Jerusalem. And you see this chronology of people that lived in Jerusalem. Then there's a new section from verse 10 to verse 13 talks about the priesthood. These are people descended from Aaron. And from verse 10 it says, from the priests. So that's very obvious. We're talking about the priests. And he's talking about the priests connected to the other thing I've got marked in verse 11 is the house of God. Okay?
Yeah.
And then at verse 13, and their relatives and the heads of their families, their fathers' households, 1,760, were very able men for the work of the service of the house of God. So the priests were specifically responsible for the actual services, the worship services. Not all the other stuff. We're going to see that in a minute. But the priest was the one who actually officiated in the services of the temple.
Yeah.
It had to be a priest, not just a Levite. So it talks about the priests, specifically the lineage of the priests, through Aaron, that made them priests, not just Levites. And they were priests for the function, as it says in that last verse, they were priests for the function, the work of the service of the house of God. Now, does that make sense? The function of the priest. So if you're a descendant of the priests, descended from Aaron, you know that you're going to go to Jerusalem and you're going to be involved in the worship service in the temple itself. So that's that first division, the priests. The next division we get is starting at verse 14 and going on. And this is the genealogies of the Levites who returned. So these are not the priests. These are the Levites. We saw that, as I say it right here in my note, 10 jobs for the Levites in Jerusalem. And we're going to look at those right now.
It's a lot of job opportunities.
That's right. We have a tendency to think the temple, okay, there was the temple worship and there was a couple of priests and they were doing this and that. And okay, the priests were there and okay, that's the priests. But we're going to see there are a lot of other jobs that needed to be done in order for the priests to do their function of the worship service. Just like in churches today, there are people that vacuum the floors. There are people that got to be greeters. There are people who make sure the place is picked up, make sure the sound system is on. There are all kinds of jobs besides the pastor's job of actually doing the service, right? So this chapter is really about the behind the scenes nitty gritty performed by the people of the Levite tribe that were not priests.
That's cool.
Okay? So we go. Let's look at this. So then into 16, this finishes up the people, the Levites that were moving into Jerusalem. And it says they lived in the villages of the Netophathites. Can you pronounce that?
Netophathites?
Yeah, okay. Netophathites. Now, Netophatha were the suburbs of Jerusalem.
Okay.
So when it talks about these people, it talks about these people that are coming back to Jerusalem, and they lived in the city, but also in the direct suburbs of the city. And we're going to see why that's important in just a few verses. Okay. So now it's starting to get into the specific jobs. And the first one is the jobs about the gates. Now I want you to read from verse 17 all the way down to verse 22.
Okay.
Don't worry about the names. You could just try with the names. But what I want you to watch in this section is how many times it talks about what the gatekeepers are doing.
Okay.
So go ahead.
And now the gatekeepers were Shallum and Akub and Talmon and Ahiman and their relatives, Shallum the chief being stationed until now at the king's gate to the east. These were the gatekeepers.
So the chief gatekeeper was at the king's gate on the east side of the temple. All right, keep going.
Okay. These were the gatekeepers for the camp of the sons of Levi.
Now stop there. There's a switch. We got gatekeepers from the temple, and we have gatekeepers. This role of Levite gatekeeper went all the way back to when they didn't have a temple. All they had was a camp traveling with the tabernacle.
Okay.
And
Yeah.
even back to the tabernacle, there had to be gatekeepers. So these Levites, their relatives have been gatekeepers. It's like saying, I'm a gatekeeper. My father, my grandfather, and great-grandfather were all gatekeepers. So this is going from the temple, the king's gate, all the way to saying these were gatekeepers for the camp of the sons of Levi.
Okay.
So now verse 19.
Shallum, the son of Kor, the son of Ebiasaph, the son of Korah, and his relatives of his father's house, the Korahites, were over the work of the service, keepers of the thresholds of the tent. And their fathers had been
keepers of the threshold. That's again gatekeepers.
Okay.
Now this is a tent. This is not the temple.
So this is
the tabernacle.
Back in the day. And their fathers had been over the camp of the Lord, keepers of the entrance.
Gatekeepers. Okay. Keep going.
Phinehas, the son of Eleazar, was ruler over them previously, and the Lord was with him. Zechariah, the son of Meshelemiah, was gatekeeper of the entrance of the tent of meeting. So
now we have gatekeepers that were gatekeepers into the tent area, and then we have gatekeepers of the actual entrance to the tent.
Okay. So levels almost.
That's right. You got the gatekeepers that basically were the entrance to the door of the entire complex, the camp. And then you've got gatekeepers at the actual tent itself. And we know by the New Testament, by Jerusalem, there were gatekeepers that made sure that the Gentiles didn't come into the wrong court. The women didn't come into the wrong court. There were gatekeepers. Pick up with 22.
Okay. All these who were chosen to be gatekeepers at the thresholds were 212. These were enrolled by genealogy in their villages, whom David and Samuel the seer appointed in their office of trust.
So this is an office of trust. This was an important office for the Levites to function as gatekeepers. Okay? And in verse 23, so they and their sons had charge of the gates of the house of the Lord, even the house of the tent. So we're talking about the temple and even back to the tent as guards. 24, the gatekeepers were on all four sides. So there had to be a lot of gatekeepers.
Yeah.
Because there were gates on all four sides, and then there were gates within the gates in the tent itself and in the temple itself. So we see there were lots of gatekeepers. Now, the interesting thing about the villages, verse 25 that I talked about, their relatives in their villages were to come in every 7 days to be with them. Now, this is shift changes. Apparently, there were 7 days on and 7 days off, where if you were off, your relatives could come in and visit you. So the people in the villages directly around them supported the Levites and the gatekeepers. 26, the 4 chief gatekeepers who were Levites were in an office of trust and were over the chambers and over the treasuries in the house of God. They spent the night around the house of God because the watch was committed to them, and they were in charge of opening it morning by morning. So these are guys who were gatekeepers all night long.
Yep.
And the writer is making sure that if your genealogy was a gatekeeper, he wanted to make sure that you understood gatekeeping was this office of significant trust. This wasn't a minor little job. You were guarding the house of God.
Yeah.
You were responsible as an office of trust, even to the point where David recognized you. Remember that verse where it says they set him up as an office of trust for the temple. So now we see very quickly, we're going to see the rest of these jobs go along here, and they're just interesting. We see the next job is the worship utensils. Verse 28, now some of them had charge of the utensils of service, for they counted them when they had brought them in and when they took them out. So the utensils of service were things like the incense burner and the bowl where the sacrifice was made on the altar.
Okay.
The hooks that they used to keep the sacrifices on the altar in the fire. These were utensils of the service that the priests used. So there had to be somebody, this would be like in a modern worship service in our church, there had to be somebody that had to make sure that the music stands were up in the front for the worship band. They had to make sure the microphones were turned on. They had the stuff required for the service to happen. They were in charge of the utensils. It would be like the deacons, when it's Communion Sunday, they bring out the trays with the wine and the bread. We don't even think about these guys, but there had to be somebody in charge of the utensils. Then read verse 29.
Some of them also were appointed over the furniture and over all the utensils of the sanctuary.
Now, this is interesting because these are not the utensils of the worship service. These are utensils of the sanctuary and the furniture, like showbread table that it sat on. The burners that were left, like the 10 candle lampstand, that had to be taken care of. It had to be moved. It had to be cleaned. It had to be taken care of. So there had to be guys in charge of the furniture. These would be like guys in your church that I got to make sure all the seats are correctly aligned for the worship service. They're in charge of the furniture. Interesting, huh?
Yeah.
You think of, there had to be somebody in the temple that took care of the furniture, especially when they were moving it in the tabernacle, but even in the temple, it had to be taken care of. Now it goes on. Read the rest of 29.
Okay.
There's another group, another job.
Yeah, so they were also over the fine flour and the wine and the oil and the frankincense and the spices.
Keep going.
Some of the sons of the priests prepared the mixing of the spices.
Okay. And then they go, okay, that's up to this point. I put over here, that's the pantry. There were guys that were in charge of all of the foodstuffs in the pantry. They had to make sure that they had enough of all the ingredients that they needed for the things. Now, besides the ingredients, then you had the kitchen staff. Look at verse 31. You got one of the Levites who was firstborn, had the responsibility over the things which were baked in pans. So these are the bakers. They had to show bread. Verse 32 mentions the show. Some of their relatives, the sons of the Kohathites, were over the showbread to be prepared every Sabbath. And then, so you have the kitchen, bakers. These are not priests. These are Levites who are preparing the stuff that the priests are going to use in the service. Do you see that flow?
Okay. Yeah.
Kind of interesting. The last job that's mentioned of the 10 jobs are the singers. In fact, read verse 33 and 34.
Okay. Now these are the singers, heads of fathers' households of the Levites, who lived in the chambers of the temple free from other service, for they were engaged in their work day and night.
And then it's just a summation. It says, these are the heads of the households of the Levites, according to their generations, chief men who lived in Jerusalem and did all these jobs. Now, it's interesting, that last one of the singers. I've been involved with churches that had big discussions of whether we should have a worship band. or whether we should just have a guy who leads and everybody sings. And there are no head singers, there's no choir, there's no like this. It is clear that in the temple, as part of the worship services, there was a dedicated full-time choir.
Yeah.
That in the book of Psalms where it talks about the choir director and the choir should be singing this and that and the other thing. But it's very clear from this verses that part of the jobs of the Levites were the singers who full-time, day and night, all they did was sing or prepare to sing.
Yeah. Yeah, I thought it was interesting. It said day and night. So they
Yeah.
have a night shift.
Yeah. There was stuff going on day and night. There's a psalm that talks about blessed are the night watchers in the temple.
Yeah.
The night shift. Okay. Now, they may not have had worship services, but they had prayer times and the choir would sing. And if it wasn't singing, it was preparing to sing because all they did was a full-time job was to bring music to the temple. So
That's cool.
yeah.
Yeah, I think we talked about that in an earlier chapter as well. I think it talked about the music.
Exactly. And he's making sure that as he's talking here, that these jobs of the Levites in the city of Jerusalem, they were going to live there and they were going to worship there, they were going to work there, that there are no minuscule jobs. And now you and I could take that for application. We could say in our church, there are no menial jobs. If you're serving coffee, you're like the bakers who are making sure the stuff was ready for the service. If you're vacuuming, you're like the housekeepers of the temple, which is an office of trust. Very interesting. And I hope you can take away from that. Look at the next service that you go to in your church and look at all the people involved besides the pastor and the worship band. Those are the guys up front. But there are tons and tons of servants who are serving the Lord in our modern house of the Lord, the church, and helping serve the public come into service to worship. It's a great application. An interesting chapter. Today we've been talking about the return of Israel to Jerusalem and the focus on all the services in the temple. I'd like to recommend a video to you. It's called God's Warning to the City of Jerusalem. It's out of the book of Isaiah, the 29th chapter, and I think you'll enjoy it. And if you do, be sure to hit the subscribe button and the like button. And I'd love to hear your comments. And we'll continue in our study in First Chronicles next week. And until then, God bless you.